Last night and today as well, you heard Rick Steves and others talk about alternatives, and he was talking particularly about alternatives with respect to drug policy and particularly with respect to marijuana, but he did talk about some other things as well. Now we're going to hear from some of these other perspectives, and our first speaker is Professor Alex Stevens, criminal justice professor at the University of Kent, who has done some of the earliest research on Portugal and report on some of the other alternative ways of dealing with these as well. So happy to welcome. We have people here from Washington, Oregon, Mexico, and Canada, but Alex gets the long distance ribbon. So thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. As Bill said, my name is Alex Stevens from the University of Kent in England. I'll have to lean in, I think, or maybe try and put these up. Is that okay? Great. This is my first time in Texas. I'm enjoying it. I've had a hugely warm welcome, and I want to thank you all for that. And I thank especially Bill Martin and his lovely wife Patricia for the warm welcome they've extended to me. I want to return the favour by extending an invitation to you, all you here, and those people watching on the webcast. In May, in Canterbury, in England, where I come from, we're holding the conference of the International Society for the Study of Drug Policy. We're holding it right next to our magnificent cathedral, and that is a church with a steeple. And so all of you here, all of you on the webcast are interested in these drug policy issues, you'd be very welcome to attend that and learn more. I'm hoping to give you a snippet of some of the things we'll be discussing here when I talk about this evidence from Europe around decriminalisation, depenalisation, and public health. And you'll notice that the word legalisation doesn't occur in the title of this slide. The reason is because we don't have any evidence about legalisation because we cannot do legalisation. As John Coleman was saying this morning, we have an international convention in place that prevents us, has prevented us for years, doing legalisation. So all we can do to try and test some of these ideas, these arguments that have been going back and forth today, is look at those countries that have moved a little bit along the way, a little bit along this spectrum towards more rational, perhaps less harmful drug policies and see what they say. Before we do that, I want to make one thing very clear. Europe is not Texas. You'll know that. We have very different cultures, political systems, economic styles of life, and so we need to be very careful about the idea that we could just transplant one system from one country to another. So I want to just show you a snippet of the differences between Texas and some of these European countries I'm talking about. The first thing growing up in England that we learn about Texas is big. We learned this from John Wayne. I learned that from John Wayne. As a criminologist, the first thing you learn about Texas, if you study it at all, I teach comparative criminology, and the first thing we learn about Texas is that it imprisons a hell of a lot of people. I'm going to use my normal themed laser pointer here. There you go. That is one of the highest rates in the world. If we compare it to, for example, the Netherlands, a much smaller population, but also a much smaller prison population and a rate of incarceration that is a fraction of that you have in Texas and other US states. If we look at Portugal, Portugal's an interesting case because the prison population has fallen quite significantly since they decriminalised drugs. And again, it used to have a much higher rate than this. It used to be one of the most incarcerating countries in Western Europe. But still, it's nowhere near, never got anywhere near where the US and Texas are now. And if you look at Switzerland, one of the reasons I know that Texas is big is because you can fit the landmass of Switzerland into Texas 20 times over. You can fit the population of Switzerland into Texas 3 times over, but you can fit the prison population of Switzerland into the Texas prison system 28 times over. You imprison a hell of a lot of people, and that's very important in terms of the context of the drug policy debates we have and the choices we make about how we deal with the deindustrialization and the despair in the inner cities that we've been discussing just recently. The alternatives to prohibition that I'm going to be discussing, therefore, include the model of depenalisation, or deciding not to prosecute some types of drug law offence, and the archetype of this would be the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, it is still a criminal offence to possess these drugs, including marijuana, but the prosecutors have chosen not to prosecute it. Whereas in Portugal, it's been taken out of the criminal law and put into the administrative law. So we have, in Portugal, decriminalisation compared to depenalisation in the Netherlands. And in Switzerland, we have a very interesting comprehensive public health model known as the Four Pillars model that I'll tell you about. And it includes this idea, revolutionary to some people, that we should give people who are dependent on heroin a clean, medically regulated supply of heroin. So I'm going to be talking about some of that. Bill asked me to talk about the UK, but I thought I didn't have much time, so I thought I'd just tell you that the UK, in this, as in many other issues, sits somewhere in the Atlantic, halfway between Europe and the US. We have some punitive aspects, some of these aspects as well. The only way in which we are more extreme than the US is in this. In the US, you are 4 times more likely to be arrested for a drug offence if you're black than if you're white, and you're 10 times more likely to be imprisoned for a drug offence if you're black than if you're white. In England and Wales, I did the sums on this, having come back from the DPA conference, when these issues were raised, and nobody had done these sums in England, much to our shame. I found out that in England, you're 6 times more likely to be arrested if you're black than if you're white, and you're 11 times more likely to be imprisoned if you're black than if you're white, which is more than the disparity in the US. Now, we might have got rid of slavery a few years before you did, but the stain of racism is still on both our societies. The difference occurs because of the punitiveness that we apply to these offences. We don't do things like take the vote away from people for the rest of their lives. We don't exclude people from being a beautician or a lawyer or a gardener for having a felony arrest on their record. We don't take away people's welfare benefits because they have a drug record. But still, we have this over-representation of people of African and Caribbean origin in the prison systems in our country. Okay. Those people who oppose this movement away from the prohibition model commonly make some criticisms, and we heard very good examples from them from the elected representatives and police chiefs from the local area here this morning. One of these is that if you take off the pressure of the penal response, this will lead to an increase in drug use by making it seem acceptable and normal. And I call this the sending messages or telegraphic argument, somehow that we could communicate to people through the criminal law and make them stop using drugs. Another argument is the deterrence argument, the idea that if you take these penalties away, then people will, again, increase their use of drugs because they're not so scared of being punished anymore. And the third one is that by spending money in the public healthcare system and providing decent treatment to people, we're spending a lot of money that we can't afford. And I would call that the fiscal conservative argument. So I'm going to try and use these examples from Europe to try and test out some of these arguments that have been made against moving towards less punitive and, I would say, more rational ways of dealing with drug policy. Let's start with the Netherlands, a small country not far from where I come from. In 1976, the Netherlands decided, or had decided for a few years, it had a heroin problem. Indeed, some people did blame that, I'm afraid to say, on GIs based in West Germany who'd come back from Vietnam with a heroin problem and were finding ways of getting heroin in the Amsterdam market. The Dutch had 2 commissions that looked into the evidence on this and aimed after these commissions to separate the markets for what were known as threatening drugs and those that had less severe consequences. This is code words for heroin and cannabis. The aim was to separate these 2 markets out, as Ethan was talking about earlier. So they didn't stop these offences being a crime. They just said, according to the principles of tolerance that have long characterised Dutch life, they call it gedogen, they would tolerate these offences under certain circumstances, known as the AHG guidelines. So as long as you didn't advertise or sell to minors or sell large amounts, currently the definition of a large amount is 5 grams. I'm sorry to be using the imperial system. That's about 1/5 of a gram, I believe. Sorry, 1/5 of an ounce. As long as there was no nuisance around where the sales were happening and no sale of hard drugs, then you wouldn't be prosecuted for selling or buying or possessing this substance, cannabis, marijuana. And this led to some interesting developments within the cannabis markets. That's going to be my method today, is to take you through the developments that have happened in these countries. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a growth of an underground illicit market, both for heroin and for cannabis, largely through sort of countercultural centres where young people were going. In the late 70s, the system that they had from 1976 was not designed to produce coffee shops. It was designed to say that people who were going to these countercultural centres and dealing drugs on an individual basis would not be prosecuted for it. But people twigged onto the fact that you can make a good, profitable business out of this, so why don't we turn it into a shop, a coffee shop? And this spread from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, there was a spread of the coffee shops, and the prosecutorial guidelines were perhaps rather laxly imposed. And from the mid-90s onwards, you saw increasing restrictions. So in the mid-90s, you had about 1,500 coffee shops in the Netherlands. You've now got between 600 and 700. There's been a dip in the number of coffee shops. And there's been some interesting research done by people like Dirk Korff and Robert McCoon, which suggested that the peaks in initiation into cannabis use coincided around when the underground market was unregulated and outside the law, and then again when the coffee shops were growing and advertising themselves. This is known as the commercialization hypothesis. It's not the presence of coffee shops, or indeed the failure to prosecute these offences, that is associated with increases in use. It's more to do with whether you're advertising it. So there's a lesson here for states in the US that are thinking of depenalising or decriminalising cannabis use. What can you do if commercial speech is free speech? There is a danger here that if you advertise these substances, use will go up. Let's look at what happened since then, though. I'm sorry for the blurry nature of this. This is taken from the national evaluation that was done by Marguerite Van Laar and colleagues about what's happened with prevalence. And you'll see that since the mid-90s, this sort of peak here, if anything, it's stabilised or declined. You don't see an increase in this use since they've started putting more restrictions on the coffee shops. More importantly, we want to test this idea. I say more importantly because I'm not that bothered about people like Russ smoking cannabis every day if it's not harming them. I'm more interested in what's harming people. Obviously, the greatest harm that is related to drug use is death. This is a graph that shows us the age profile of those people who are dying in the late 80s, early 90s, late 90s, and the decade more recently. And you'll see this group is the 15 to 34-year-olds, and this group is the 35 to 64-year-olds. What you've seen is a massive increase in the proportion of that group of the population that is old. You're seeing, this is evidence that the market separation has succeeded in stopping people, young people coming into the bottom rows of the heroin market. And indeed, you've seen massive reductions over recent years in injecting drug use, which we'll see again later on. So some evidence that this idea that you separate the markets out by regulating, to a certain extent, the retail cannabis market and still having penalties for heroin dealing seems to have worked for the Netherlands. Let's move on now to Portugal. If we look at the historical context, Portugal was a closed dictatorship until 1974. It was very hard to get drugs in or out of Portugal. Once that lid came off, parties happened all over the Iberian Peninsula once they got rid of their dictators, and there was a lot of increase in drug use both in Spain and in Portugal after their dictators left. Associated with an increased use in heroin in the 90s, had very concerning increases in injecting drug use, especially around the slum areas that were in Lisbon. Portugal's a very unequal and poor country by European standards, certainly in those days. They were very concerned about this, and so they instituted a scientific commission to look at the evidence from around the world about how can you deal with these problems, what works. Out of that study, they created a national plan which emphasised solidarity, this idea that we should have no separation between people who are using drugs and the rest of society. We should proclaim that we are one people, and we deal with those people as people who have needs, not as criminals who need to be thrown out of society. We want to have more treatment, and we want to decriminalise. Portugal, very importantly, did not just do decriminalisation. There was a raft of measures they put around that, which are important when we look at the trends. They decriminalised the possession of small amounts of all types of illicit substances. There is no longer a criminal offence to be in possession of less than 10 days' supply of heroin, cocaine, amphetamine, and cannabis. And instead of going to a court, you get sent through an administrative system to a commission for the dissuasion of addiction, made up of a lawyer, a psychologist, and a social worker, who will assess you, see your needs, in most cases give you a warning and no further action, but does have the power to impose fines or restrictions on your driving licence or on your ability to carry firearms, or can require you to attend a police station or a treatment centre regularly. And they expanded treatment, including a 67% increase in low-threshold methadone maintenance substitution treatments. Now, the fear was that this would lead, through the sending messages and deterrence arguments, that there would be a massive increase both in drug use amongst the native population and also that people would start tumbling into Portugal as drug tourists. Now, this is a survey that's done with school children across Europe, and you see that for nearly all these substances, it was increasing from 95 to 99, 99 to 2003, but since 2003, amongst this age group, amongst 16-year-olds, those people we're most concerned about, as Bill was talking about earlier, those people we're most concerned about initiating their drug use, we're seeing a fall in drug use amongst that population, which is the population that I'm most concerned about starting drug use. There's some evidence of increases in lifetime use amongst the older population, but not necessarily increases in current use, which suggests people may have taken the chance to experiment more but didn't continue in their older years. Portugal, as I said, had and still has a big problem with HIV and AIDS associated with injecting drug use. Here we see some of the most convincing evidence, I think, for the success, not necessarily the decriminalisation, but of the whole package of reforms. Massive reductions in the incidence of HIV and AIDS amongst drug users between 2000 and 2008 after this package of reforms was implemented. And as we've seen earlier, there's this debate about imperfect indicators. We have imperfect indicators, and there's a debate going on about what's happened with drug-related death in Portugal. And they used to just have this indicator, which is an indicator that relies on toxicological tests on dead bodies. And if they found traces of a substance, they would call that a drug-related death. Now, the problem with this is, if you do more toxicological autopsies, you will find more people who have drugs in them, even if those people haven't died from the drugs, they just happen to be using drugs sometime before they died. That's what happened with this line. That line went up because more autopsies were being done. This line has only more recently become available. This is a line based on the international system for classification of drug-related deaths. And it shows significant reductions between 2001 down to 2005, and maybe slight increases since. Now, I agree that there's been too much selective use of data around Portugal, but some indicators are better than others. And this black line is a better indicator than this grey line. It suggests to me that we can be more confident that drug-related deaths have decreased than they've increased. Indeed, in the article that John was speaking about earlier, of which I'm a co-author, despite not being from Australia, he quoted the bit that's not in bold, but he didn't add the end of this sentence. And I think, John, much as I respect the integrity of your position and your belief, I think it's a little bit disingenuous not to have included the conclusion of this, which is we have a nuanced picture, but a generally positive picture of the overall implications of this reform. Let's look at Switzerland. Switzerland has this bizarre idea, to British eyes, that if you get enough signatures on the ballot, you can have a vote about something. We don't think much of this in England. But they've had several referenda about their drug policy here. You'll see here, je veux garder nos parcs publics sans seringues. I want to keep syringes out of our public parks. And I want to say yes to an effective drug policy, a drug policy that's based on these four pillars, which has been tried to be knocked down by opponents of this, what they would see as being a more lax drug policy, but has been defeated in referendums by votes of the public, including this reinvention of the idea of heroin-assisted treatment, which the Swiss originally took from my country, but we had a prototype system. They improved it. As a colleague, an academic in Britain said, we had a rather rusty old lock knife. They turned it into a nice Swiss Army knife, shiny, new, and lots of tools on it. So in Switzerland, if we look at these stages, there was a growth, as there was across Europe, in cannabis and heroin use. And they wanted to start with quite a strict law enforcement approach, with quite strict restrictions on needle exchange and methadone. Doctors campaigned in ways that built a movement between the public and the public health professionals to try and get some of those restrictions down. So outreach services started to be provided. But this led to the development of what were known as the needle parks, where large numbers of drug users would congregate in public parks in some of the big cities there. And this wasn't considered to be a very satisfactory solution. So they looked around again. What the evidence suggests would be an effective drug policy. What we'll do is we'll close the needle parks, but we'll open up clinical harm reduction services, not leaving people out on the streets to inject, but to bring them in to the treatment services. That includes providing rooms where people can safely inject the drugs they've bought on the illicit market, and it also includes providing clinics where they will be prescribed safe pharmaceutical heroin with support systems around them. Obviously, this was controversial, but in 1997 they had another one of these weird referenda, and it was defeated. The idea that the Swiss population supported by quite a large majority the idea we should have heroin-assisted treatment to protect our heroin users from the problems that they have. It's not all gone one way, though. There's, emboldened by this move towards harm reduction, campaigners in Switzerland have tried to have referenda to legalise drugs, and they've been defeated as well. A typically moderate Swiss position between the two extremes. But this is one of these places where they give heroin to a person who's dependent on it, and he can inject it in a safe clinical environment. It's only for people who've not responded well to methadone treatment. It's quite a limited, restricted eligibility. Heroin-assisted treatment is more expensive than methadone treatment. You don't necessarily want to use it as your first-line treatment if you're interested in saving costs in the public health system. People can come to the clinic 2 or 3 times a day if they need to inject their heroin. There's full medical support there. This eliminates the problems of overdose that are so common when people are having to hide away. It eliminates the problems of people injecting their groin or their neck or their toes. You don't get people getting abscesses when they're injecting in these sorts of environments. They're supported by psychosocial services. They're enabled to find housing, to help to find work, helped if they have any mental health issues they need support with. And the results have been quite striking. All these results are the sorts of results you'd want to see from any drug treatment system: stabilisation of use, significant health improvements, reductions in crime that were so big that they offset the cost of the treatment, even though heroin-assisted treatment is more expensive than methadone. Not much diversion to the illicit market, no increase, very importantly, in initiation into heroin use, people being integrated into a range of services instead of being socially excluded on the margins of society, and indeed, as people were saying earlier, some evidence that people move on from this very boring clinical style of using heroin to getting rid of their substance problem. I highly recommend the works of Ambros Uchtenhagen, who's the hero of this story, who's done so much to make this happen and to make sure the world knows about it. Alongside that, we have cannabis policy. Again, it's a mixed story. We have a tolerance of advertised seed shops and grow operations in the early 2000s. Cantons in Switzerland can do what they want depending on their own democratic operations. Some of them were very tolerant of people setting up businesses that were selling this sort of stuff quite freely on the open market. And according to work by the Swiss criminologist Martin Kilias, it's only when these things were clamped down on that cannabis use started to fall again. There were quite high levels of initiation into cannabis use while there was this commercial availability and promotion of seed shops, grow operations. So we do need to be careful about what happens if you combine availability with advertising. Some cantons in Switzerland allow people in them to grow small-scale cannabis for themselves. This week, just on Wednesday, I believe, the Parliament voted to decriminalise possession of less than 10 grams of cannabis, less than 2/5 of an ounce. This is the proposal, but there is fight back from some elements of Swiss society against this. And they're also planning to trial a provision of cannabis through clinics, I suppose similar to the heroin-assisted treatment, where you'd have regulated materials, not as strong as some that are available on the street, limited amounts and limited times that you can get it. If we look at the trends, cannabis rose to a peak in the early 2000s, at this time that Martin Kilias says we had this sort of more free and promoted availability of cannabis, and it has dropped since the clampdown on those. Heroin, there was a very sharp rise in the people starting to use heroin when we had open drug scenes, when they had open drug scenes in the needle parks, and it's been a rapid decline since then, since it's been brought inside the clinics. Other drug use has been largely stable over this period. The most encouraging trend I would think you see from the Swiss data is a very significant reduction in the number of people dying from these substances, 350 to 400 per year in the 1990s, but since the success of these policies, we see much lower rates of drug-related death. Okay. So we've looked at a few international countries. What about if we compare countries across them? And this idea that there's some sort of correlation, that if we deter and punish and send messages, that we'll get lower rates of drug use. Now, if you look at these countries along here, this is the green bar is the prevalence of cannabis use in the past year. And you'll see Italy has flip-flopped between decriminalisation and punishing people. Scotland is a bit more punitive than England. The USA is one of the most punitive countries in the world on it. Australia, not so much. France, quite punitive for cannabis. England and Wales, quite punitive more less recently. Netherlands depenalised, Germany, some states in Germany have depenalised, Portugal is decriminalised, and Sweden still has an aspiration for a drug-free society. The lesson I draw from this is no correlation whatsoever between what your drug policy is, how punitive it is, what messages you're sending, and what levels you end up with cannabis. If not law enforcement and drug policy, what is it that we might look to explain why countries have different levels of drug use and drug-related harm? One of the things that matters is harm reduction services. You see, countries which have adopted harm reduction services late in the epidemic, like USA, like Portugal, Portugal still has a high rate, even though it's falling rapidly. USA still has a much higher rate than countries like the UK and Switzerland, which adopted harm reduction measures much earlier in the epidemic. And you see the numbers here. These are the numbers of injecting drug users in the country. So even if heroin is not the major problem in USA or Texas and cocaine is, you still have much, much more injecting drug users than we do, compared to, for example, to the Netherlands, which has relatively minuscule amounts of people who are injecting drugs. The other thing that matters, I found, I almost stumbled across this for those statistics geeks amongst you, this is a negative correlation of 0.62. It's quite a strong statistic, moderate to strong statistical association. On the vertical scale, you'll see the estimated prevalence of injecting drug use. So you'll see that USA is high on that scale, whereas the Netherlands is low. On the horizontal scale, you'll see there's a measure of what's called decommodification. Decommodification is a measure of how generous your welfare state is. How have the goods and services of welfare been decommodified, taken out of the market, and if you haven't got money to pay for them, you can get them anyway. The Netherlands, Norway, and Denmark have very strong, generous welfare states. USA, Australia, not so much. You see here, I think, a very intriguing relationship between how generous a country's welfare state is and the level of at least one very problematic type of drug use is. We have here a choice that societies have taken about how to deal with the consequences of deindustrialization and underemployment of those groups of people who have become obsolete under globalization. Some countries have chosen to maintain strong levels of welfare support that are capable of reintegrating, or at least giving people a chance of getting back into the labour market. Other countries have chosen punitive incarceration policies that hide people away from this ability to get back into productive, meaningful occupations that they value, and which mean that they don't need to seek oblivion in the most harmful forms of drug use. So I'm going to list now some provisional conclusions. I'm saying these are provisional conclusions because, as we've heard repeatedly today, we have reasonably poor data, and we cannot do randomized controlled trials of drug policy. Much as social scientists would love to say to the countries of the European Union, we are going to randomly allocate you to a punitive policy or a harm reduction policy or legalization policy and see if their populations like it or not, we have to deal with imperfect methods and imperfect data. That imperfect methods and imperfect data really suggests to me some conclusions that relate back to these arguments we had earlier about what would happen if we have these more liberal approaches. They suggest that reducing penalties for drug users does not automatically lead to increased use and harms, as was suggested at this table this morning. There is, however, an apparent association between increased advertising and promotion and increased drug use and harms. It's probable also that if you were to reduce prices, that you would see increased use. The question is, how damaging is that use? What type of use is it? It's not ham reduction services. We don't reduce ham in Europe. It's harm reduction services. Actually, in Portugal especially, people love harm. The evidence suggests that harm reduction services have been so vigorously resisted by the US federal government, and I was so disappointed to see the decision recently to revert to banning needle exchange at the federal level, because these harm reduction services have shown again and again and again that they save lives. And if we say that we're compassionate, we believe in justice, then we should be implementing these policies that we know work. And if we say that we believe in fiscal responsibility, we should also be investing our money in things that save us money. Imprisonment does not save us money. It produces harms that have to be repaired. Sometimes those harms have to be repaired by furthermore imprisonment, and a cycle that goes on and on. Whereas we have available to us policies which have been shown to save the public more than they cost to provide. Yet, in many countries, sometimes including my own, we are not implementing these policies. And I'd ask you to consider why that is and what we can do about it. I'd like finally to close by just a little plug for those of you who are interested in finding more about this. I've got a book out called Drugs, Crime and Public Health. It's available to you on Amazon. It has a 5-star review. My mother's a very generous reviewer. And so I hope if you are interested in this, you'll be able to look up those more. Or I'm very happy to come and talk, to take questions personally after this is finished. Thank you very much.
I had mentioned this is my book here, and I meant to mention ahead of time and was going to, but I'm glad you did. It's called Drugs, Crime and Public Health. It's available in a number of places on the web at wildly different prices. So you should check around. If you happen to find one of the really more expensive ones the first time, well, ask around. But it's a very thoughtful book dealing with ethical and many questions that are go into a number of things just besides the charts, which I find fascinating too. Oh, there you are. Just make sure you're here. Our next speaker is Gary Hale, whom I mentioned at lunch, who's a former DEA intelligence chief and is now working in Mexico, and he can tell you some about what he's doing there. We had hoped originally to have appearing with Gary, so the two of them could discuss, as we had some discussions this morning, Jorge Castañeda, the former foreign minister of Mexico, and now a professor at NYU and speaking out regularly on a number of subjects. He was not able to be here from this time, but I found some suggestions that he has made that you can respond to if you like, but you can say whatever you want to. But he said this is kind of a concise statement of some of the things he's been recommending recently, that we should pull the Army back. The military's been a large part of the problem, and taking troops out of the streets is essential to restore normalcy and stop the violence. That sending troops to combat drug traffickers made the war on drugs a literal war in the streets of Mexico, resulting in tens of thousands of civilian casualties. Second was to build up a national police force like the one in Colombia in order to curtail the violence and focus on crimes that directly affect people like kidnapping and homicide, rather than combat drug traffickers. And that the United States should legalize drugs, or at the very least seek another viable option. And he also calls on the Mexican government to he said, to come clean on the question of legalization, and that Latin American governments, in addition to Mexico, need to have their voices heard, lobbying the United States toward legalization. He said it would be difficult, but the two countries have the moral authority to advocate for U.S. legalization because they have been the ones suffering the consequences of America's prohibitionist policies. But now we're going to welcome Gary Hale, who is, as I said earlier, has been a valuable addition to the Baker Institute in the last year.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you for the warm welcome, Bill, that you've given me to attend and share some of my experiences with you. Most of the discussion today, from what I've seen on the agenda and the speakers that I've had an opportunity to witness this afternoon, talked about what we called in the drug enforcement world, my former world, the demand side of the equation. In the overall context of how we in government look at the counter-drug effort, there's the supply side, where it comes from, or where it's manufactured, or where it's cultivated, and the demand side, which is the part of the equation where folks are wanting that particular product, whatever it may be. So I've spent most of my time on the supply side, working on the supply side, looking at counter-drug efforts, looking at intelligence processes that would help people like Mr. Coleman when he was the agent in charge in Boston. He was my boss there in those days back in the 80s, helping them make decisions about how to best utilize government resources in the counter-drug effort. So, slightly different perspective from what we've talked about here today so far. And so I'm gonna talk about Mexico, because that's a country that is our neighbor, and it's a critical issue about, especially as to what's going on and all the discussions about spillover violence and possible terrorism connections and government of Mexico will and how it interrelates with the United States, and following on kind of like with the international trend of the discussion that we've been having so far this afternoon. And then at the end of my comments, I'll talk a little bit about how I look at the legalization question from my particular perspective. So we have to consider that with regard to Mexico, that Mexico is a friend. It is a country that has been tied to the United States before the United States existed. If you go 30 miles west of here on I-10, you'll come to a little town called San Felipe, where Stephen F. Austin was giving out land grants on behalf of the government of Mexico before Texas ever became a republic or a state of the United States. So Mexico, as we all know, owned a great part of the Southwest, including Texas, and so all of the culture and the music and the language and all of the many things that make up our cultures have been common to the United States and Mexico for hundreds of years. So that puts a little bit of context into how people in Mexico look at the United States and this entire kind of drug situation. In the last 12 years, and the Mexican presidential terms are 6 years at a time. So in the last 12 years, or two sexenios they're called, 2 6-year terms, the last 2 presidents, Calderon being the current president, whose presidency runs out in December of this year, and President Fox before him, changed their approach to counter-drug policy in Mexico, and really became iron-fisted as compared to previous administrations or the previous party. And that has changed a lot insofar as how drugs are moved, how traffickers are behaving, and what is happening in Mexico. So what happened? In about 2006, in the United States, we learned through DEA intelligence studies that cocaine prices were going up, and I'm using cocaine as a barometer here, even though in Mexico you have marijuana cultivation, opium cultivation, heroin production, transport of cocaine through Mexico coming from South America, and production of methamphetamine. So there's 4 drugs that come from Mexico. So before, around 2006, we learned that cocaine prices were going up and purities were going down. Did an exhaustive study, took about a year, and then we learned that most of the drugs were, again, cocaine. Most of the cocaine was still leaving South America, arriving in Mexico, but it wasn't coming into the United States. And this is after 6 years of hardened policies by President Fox in the beginning of President Calderon's term. So what did that tell us? That told us that the cocaine was coming in from South America and basically getting stuck inside of Mexico, and it wasn't coming through as easily as it used to be into the United States. So what caused that? It was a change in government policy in Mexico. The introduction of the Mexican military in a very hard way. Previous to Calderon, President Fox also employed the military, but it was a little more of a show of force than it was an active pursuit of drug traffickers. So the employment of the Mexican military had a significant impact, and still is having an impact on the flow of drugs through Mexico. When I say flow of drugs, I'm not, even though I'm using cocaine as a barometer, I'm talking about all these drugs, whether it's marijuana cultivated, opium cultivated and turned into heroin, methamphetamine, or cocaine coming in from South America. Had a significant impact on the flow of drugs through Mexico. Another change was that the government decided to change up the deployment of or the assignment of federal police forces, whereas before they were assigned to a particular area for a long, long time, which allowed for corruption and other arrangements to be made by with drug traffickers. That changed, and the haphazard assignment of federal officers then broke those agreements or those arrangements that had been made by federal police forces and drug traffickers. So there's a cumulative effect of a change in counter-drug policy by the Mexican government that then caused drugs to be stuck in Mexico and not make their way into the United States as easily as before. That also had a probably negative effect in that drug consumption climbed in Mexico. It also had a terrible effect in that because the flows of drugs through Mexico were constricted, then the drug traffickers started fighting over rights to passage of drugs through Mexico. It's very simple when you look at how drugs flow through Mexico, or if you look at where all the violence is occurring, you'll see that the northern border with the United States, of which Texas makes up 2/3 of the U.S.-Mexico border. So if you look at where all the violence is happening, the U.S.-Mexico border is generally an area of Mexico where it's happening. Or if you look at the Pacific states. And why? Because those are the areas of the country of Mexico where the drugs are coming in or the chemicals that are used to make those drugs. So there's conflict there among the cartels to dominate those entry points. And then there's conflict on the export side of Mexico into the United States. So where's the money being made? It's really not, this is not money, the violence is not caused by money being made of drug sales in the United States. The violence is caused by money being made for rights of passage either into Mexico or out of Mexico into the United States. So that is what's causing all of the violence and the killings and the beheadings and mutilations and dismemberments and all of the terrible things that we hear about on the radio and on TV and in the media. So it's important to understand that the violence that is occurring in Mexico is largely staying in Mexico. That doesn't mean that some of the violence is coming into the United States or it hasn't happened or doesn't happen. There are some murders. There was a shooting here over in Sugar Land not too long ago where some Mexican cartel or related traffickers killed an informant that was working with a task force. Yes, it happens. Are there events that happen right on the border? Yes, that happens as well. But largely, no. Drug violence that is occurring in Mexico is not spilling over into the United States in a large way. It's not happening. So that's a very important point to make because the media would have you think that the cartels are invading the United States and that the sky is falling and let's militarize the border. And that's a common refrain that you hear from some people in Washington and from Governor Perry, who insists that we need to militarize the U.S.-Mexico border. And it's probably an overkill to do that because of the fact that spillover violence is not occurring. If you look at spillover violence, and I spent a lot of time doing that as the chief of intel for DEA here in Houston, my program responsibility ran from San Diego to Brownsville and south. My specific responsibility was within the Houston division. So looking at these issues, we determined, and working with my counterparts in El Paso, Phoenix, and San Diego, we determined that most of the spillover that occurs, if any, occurs at the border city pairs. So take Texas, for example, Del Rio and Ciudad Acuña, Piedras Negras, and Eagle Pass, Laredo, Nuevo Laredo, Matamoros, and McAllen, Reynosa, and Brownsville, or I had that backwards, Reynosa and McAllen, and Matamoros and Brownsville. So if you look at where violence is occurring, it's generally occurring on the Mexican side of those border city pairs, and on occasion on the U.S. side. And those are usually kidnappings of somebody that was involved with the Mexican cartels, is grabbed on the U.S. side, taken to the Mexican side, and some kind of retribution was exacted. So spillover, generally speaking, stays at the border city pairs, and it really doesn't extend into the interior of Mexico. Terrorism. There are known foreign terrorist organizations. This is a legal designation that was designed by the Department of Justice and others in government. Foreign terrorist organizations, there's been, in the global sense, there's a study done that there are at least 19 of 43 known foreign terrorist organizations involved in drug trafficking or the drug business somehow or another. How many of those 19 are in Mexico? I can't tell you. I don't have the exact number, but I do know that there is some representation from the FARC, which is out of Colombia, Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, the FARC. They have an office there. It's an overt representation. There are, and this is informal remark here, based on open source and media reports, representation of extremist Islamic groups in Mexico. But are those extremist groups operating inside the United States? Are they crossing people? It's hard to say. Do we know that for fact? No, we don't. What do we know? We do know that cartel organizations that are operating on the Mexican side of the border are afraid of crossing special interest aliens, which are like Islamic type of extremists. They're afraid of crossing into the United States because they're afraid that that would truly provoke a U.S. military response in Mexico. And they don't want their business to be disturbed, and therefore they recede or retract from crossing wholesale special interest aliens into the United States from Mexico. So that's an important distinction. Has it happened? Have special interest aliens cross into the United States from Mexico? Sure. We've seen, the Border Patrol has seen plenty of indications that some extremists have come into the United States. But as a practice, are the cartels doing that? No. Is there a relationship between any particular Mexican cartel and a extremist organization? There's anecdotal information at best. Is there any fact that, for example, the Zetas are associated with the Hezbollah? There is no fact. It's all kind of a dotted line, stretched discussion that continues. But there is no fact at this point indicating that Mexican cartels are, in fact, associated with extremist organizations. Okay, so I want to end up with, that's the big picture, quick story on Mexico. I'm living there now. I've been living there for the last 2 years. Deal with academics and government folks and friends and family that are in Mexico. So I could speak for days about what's going on in Mexico, but I'll limit my remarks to what I've said thus far about Mexico, and then switch over to the theme of this conference, which is the whole question of legalization. And to that end, I'll say that I'm not a proponent and I'm not an antagonist. I'm not saying let's do it. I'm not saying let's not do it. But I am a pragmatist about the issue. And I do believe that at some point in the not too distant future, whether it's a year or 10 years from now, because time flies, as we all know, that legalization is around the corner. I do believe it's going to happen. So if that's going to happen, I do think that we need to prepare for that. And if we agree as a society that we're going to legalize the use of marijuana, and we're just talking about marijuana now and not any other particular drug, then I think we have to look at, and I haven't seen much discussion in any circle about the following, that the fact that we should prepare for legal, economic, and social implications that have not been specifically or sufficiently addressed with regard to tomorrow, let's say, if marijuana were to be legalized. For example, on the legal side, on the legal criminal side, what would legislatures do when deciding how to punish anyone who was found to be, let's say, driving while under the influence of marijuana? Is it going to differ from driving under the influence of alcohol? Well, the penalties equate to the same as driving under the influence of alcohol. Given that marijuana is considered as a hallucinogen, how will the definition of impairment differ from driving under the influence of alcohol, which alcohol is considered a depressant when it comes to toxicology and medical definitions? How will the THC content in the body be measured, as you do with alcohol, to determine levels of intoxication with regard to alcohol? Because most of the measures that currently exist are qualitative and not quantitative. So that would be an important consideration in terms of, and that's just the driving part. Imagine many other legal criminal implications that are out there. Looking at legal civil implications, what will the civil courts do when confronted with a civil suit for wrongful death caused by a marijuana intoxicated person who caused the wrongful death of another? This is all new case law that would have to be looked at when legalization would occur. Here's an interesting one. How will civil courts decide branding rights? Whether it's Pepsi or Coke or whatever, marijuana, BC Bud or Acapulco Gold, to who does that belong? And what are the commercial rights to that branding? There's going to be a lot of lawsuits when it comes to that. And are we prepared to confront those kinds of lawsuits? I haven't seen any discussion about that yet. Economic, how will the United States, Mexico, Colombia, Jamaica, and other nations decide on importation and exportation laws for marijuana? We've had some consternation between U.S. and Mexico with regard to NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. One of the ones that comes to mind when it comes to legalization question is that United States farmers and growers of produce in the United States have complained that the Mexican farmers and growers are dumping tomatoes, avocados, and a lot of other produce because and this applies to marijuana as well. The climate is good, the soil is good, there's plenty of rain. It's a tropical climate, so that it allows for a continuous cultivation of vegetables and fruits that come from Mexico into the United States. And if you're on the border, you can go to H-E-B and buy limes 10 for $1. If you go to a grocery store in Michigan, they're 25 cents a piece. So think about the supply chain, whether it's marijuana or limes, and the volume of fruits and vegetables that come from Mexico and could be marijuana as well, and truly does. We took a congressional delegation to look at the warehouse of seized drugs in Laredo, Texas, a couple of years ago. And if you go to the DEA warehouse where the seized drugs are kept prior to destruction in court, it's like a Sam's Club. I wish I had a picture to show you. It's like a Sam's Club, a huge, huge warehouse of multiple levels of racks that are just full of marijuana bales, mostly marijuana. There's some cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and other drugs as well. But there's just a tremendous volume of marijuana that comes from Mexico. And so if that continues and there was some legalization, so how are we going to look at case law with regard to how much marijuana are we going to allow to come into the United States from Mexico if it's legalized, as compared to American production? And what kind of friction will occur among the growers? Will the U.S. and other nations include marijuana as a vegetable, a drug, or other substance when considering its importation or exportation into the United States or out of it? Will the U.S. and other nations engage in trade wars, as I was talking about with NAFTA? Such as experience under NAFTA, and I already talked about the wars that the various Mexican and American farmers are already engaged in with regards to vegetables. On the social side, how will we discuss marijuana use in the social environment? Will schools teach about the detriments to the human body in health school classes? Will anyone that provides marijuana to underage youth be subjected to the same penalties as does someone who provides alcohol to a minor? Or will the punishment be more harsh given its designation as a hallucinogen? Or do we have to change that designation? Will governments be faced with having to pay reparations to the families of police officers and agents who died while working to destroy marijuana plantations in the U.S. and abroad? I'm sure most of you have heard of Red Ribbon Week, okay? The origin of that came from the death of DEA Special Agent Enrique Camarena, Kiki Camarena in the 1980s. Why was he killed? He was killed because he found the largest marijuana plantation up to that point that had ever been discovered in Mexico, a location called Buffalo. And so he led the Mexican authorities over there. They destroyed it, and then as a matter of retribution, they kidnapped him, tortured him, and killed him. So you have these decades of counter-drug operations, domestically and abroad. So, you know, what is that? What kind of a message does that give to those law enforcement agents? It's no different than sending a soldier to Afghanistan or sending a soldier to Vietnam. For some reason, whatever that reason may be, we have a common enemy and a common mission when it comes to Afghanistan, but we didn't when it came to Vietnam. So we didn't like our soldiers who went to Vietnam, but we love the ones that went to Afghanistan. Well, what about the soldiers, the agents, the police officers who have died to enforce the counter-drug laws that our governments have passed? Security. Will the drug wars in Mexico increase as more marijuana is imported into the United States? After all, as I mentioned to you before, cartel fighting in Mexico is largely about rites of passage and the money that taxation brings for that rites of passage, and less about the profits from the sale of those drugs. Will the U.S., as a significant consumer base for marijuana, be obligated to increase assistance to Mexico to enable that government to quell any increase in violence attributed to the new marijuana laws among producers? Financial cost. What will the cost of legislative, criminal, civil, educational, social, and security changes be? I don't think we've touched on the cost. We mentioned it here briefly, but there's a lot to consider when it comes to legalization. How will the U.S. government recover those costs? Are we going to tax more? Are we going to tax marijuana use? Is there going to be a marijuana excise tax, like the tobacco tax? Will the non-using marijuana public agree to being taxed for the pleasure of somebody else? If I don't smoke marijuana and you smoke marijuana, how come I'm paying the tax, the excise tax for your benefit? Proposal. So I think that we need to seriously look at these implications, whether they're criminal, legal, or legal civil, or trade, or economic, or social, or security, whatever these implications are. I believe we need to take a serious look at how the future will look if we do indeed legalize marijuana. And with that, I give that to you to ponder for the future. Thank you, Bill. Good, thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Gary. I think you've just given us an agenda for another conference. that part of the a great part of the responsibility for a public policy institute is not simply to say we're for this policy, but to try to really figure out what are the dimensions of policies, whether to keep or to change. So we appreciate that very much. Next, we're going to talk about, and after this one, we'll have a short break, and then we'll come back for our final session with Larry Campbell, and do not leave before that. We're going to invite Bill Piper, who is the executive with the Drug Policy Alliance, to talk about what are the various things going on in the United States. Thank you, Bill.
Good afternoon. Dr. Martin asked me to talk, I guess, about the United States, and in particular, state marijuana laws and what might happen, what the federal government might do if a state legalized marijuana like alcohol. And I basically have 3 points, and I'm not going to talk about science or data. Instead, I'm going to talk about the legal and constitutional and political context that the marijuana debate in the U.S. is playing out in. And I have 3 points. One, U.S. states have the right to decriminalize and legalize marijuana. 2, there's surprisingly very little that the government can do to stop them. And 3, if other countries are considering legalizing marijuana, they should go ahead and do it, even if Washington doesn't like it. So to the first point, although marijuana is illegal under federal law, states remain free to legislate almost however they like with respect to marijuana under state law. The federal government cannot require states to make marijuana illegal. In fact, the federal government can't require states to make anything illegal. Texas tomorrow, if it wanted, could eliminate its entire criminal code, and there's nothing the federal government can do about it. So if a state decides to lessen state penalties for marijuana-related offenses, to abolish certain marijuana offenses altogether, or to legalize marijuana for medical or non-medical purposes, it is free to do so. There are limits to what a state can criminalize. For instance, a state couldn't make it a crime for an African American to own property, but nothing in the Constitution requires states to criminalize anything in particular. And I think that's worth repeating, that the federal government through Congress or the courts can prohibit states from outlawing certain activities, but it cannot do the reverse. It cannot compel states to make certain activities illegal under state law. Nor can the federal government require states to support federal law. The Supreme Court made clear in 1997 in Prince v. United States that the federal government may not compel state law enforcement agents to enforce federal law or issue directives requiring states to address particular problems. So states don't have to march in lockstep with federal policy. They didn't under alcohol prohibition, and they don't under marijuana prohibition. And this is a system of dual sovereignty that our Constitution establishes. The federal government passes and enforces federal law. State governments pass and enforce state law. And I think that's relevant, in the international debate. It's somewhat disingenuous, for Vice President Biden to go down to Latin America and say the United States opposes legalization. That's not quite true. The federal government might oppose legalization, but 16 states have legalized marijuana for medical use, and so they've carved out at least certain populations that can use marijuana. Now, this doesn't mean that the federal government can't go into states and arrest people if it wants. It has pretty broad latitude under the Commerce Clause, and John Coleman talked earlier about Race v. Gonzalez, which involved a medical marijuana patient in California who was growing medical marijuana in her backyard for her own personal use. And the Supreme Court upheld federal enforcement and prosecution of her, even though the marijuana wasn't crossing state lines and even though it had absolutely nothing to do with commerce. And so the federal government has pretty wide latitude in this area. But what I think the most important thing to keep in mind about the Race case is that it only addressed the federal government's authority to enact federal law. It in no way infringes on the right of states to enact, or for that matter, not enact a particular law. It didn't invalidate any of the state medical marijuana laws. So that states can decriminalize or legalize marijuana under state law in the sense of removing criminal penalties is beyond dispute. Where it gets tricky is with licensing, regulating, and taxing marijuana, where the Constitution's supremacy clause and various preemption issues might come into play. And with most public policy issues that revolve around preemption, it revolves around whether or not a state is doing something that creates an obstacle to the federal government's enforcement of federal law, or whether Congress has chosen to completely occupy the field of regulation and control in that particular area. But when it comes to drugs, Congress actually included an anti-preemption clause in the Controlled Substances Act. And so preemption is limited under federal law with respect to drugs to the narrow set of circumstances in which there's a positive conflict between state and federal law so that the two cannot stand together. So for instance, if a state required a citizen to do something that violated federal law so that doing it risked arrest by federal agents, but not doing it risked arrest by state agents, that would be a positive conflict. But I don't know of any state drug law that has that level of a positive conflict. There is an ongoing state-level case, Pac v. Long Beach, in California, that's before the Supreme Court, in which California's Second Court of Appeals ruled that Long Beach regulations of medical marijuana create an obstacle to federal enforcement of federal law and therefore preempted by state law or by federal law. But this ruling ignores the very clear language of the Controlled Substances Act, which says it doesn't just have to be an obstacle, it has to be an actual positive conflict. And other state judges have ruled differently. And the federal government itself has never brought a preemption case against any state medical marijuana law or any state medical marijuana regulation. And I think that's probably because they know that they would lose. And then I guess most importantly at stake in the PAC case is not whether California or other states can remove criminal penalties and make it legal to possess or distribute marijuana, but whether or not if there are any limits to how far they can go in regulating, licensing, and taxing marijuana. And so that's the context, I guess, the legal and constitutional context that marijuana reform is playing out at the state level. And 16 states have legalized marijuana for medical use. 14 states have legalized it or have decriminalized it so that people are getting a ticket or it's a misdemeanor instead of a felony. And different states are doing different things. But generally, in most states, it's regulated by the state Department of Health, with the exception of California, which is the only state that regulates it locally. And I think the 16 years of experimentation in these states in which they're regulating how and where to cultivate, process, label, package, transport, store, distribute, sell, and tax, license, the production and distribution and sale of marijuana is creating an entire generation of city council members and state legislators that are beginning to realize that you actually can control marijuana. In the past couple of years, legislators in California, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Vermont, Washington, all had straight-up marijuana legalization measures introduced in their legislatures. California voters narrowly defeated an initiative in 2010 that would have legalized marijuana like alcohol. Voters in Colorado and Washington state are voting on the issue in November. Activists in a bunch of other states, including California and Oregon, are working to get similar measures on their ballots in those states. And so I think it's only a matter of time before at least one state goes that next step and just treats marijuana like alcohol instead of just making it available for medical use. I guess to put things in, a historical context of why the federal government's not going to be able to stop states from taxing and regulating marijuana like alcohol, is to look at what has happened with medical marijuana. So when Arizona and California passed its medical marijuana initiatives in 1996, the reaction from the Clinton administration was quick and harsh. They threatened to prosecute and remove the licenses of any doctor that dared to recommend marijuana to any of their patients. And thanks to the Drug Policy Alliance and other groups, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that violated the First Amendment rights of doctors. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear an appeal of that case. And since that time, no doctor has been prosecuted or arrested or threatened by the federal government for recommending marijuana to their patients. So the doctors are off limits. Not to be outdone, the Bush administration decided it was going to go in and start raiding dispensaries. And they did a significant number of raids. In most of the instances, they would go in, they would seize the marijuana, they would seize the cash, they would seize the medical records, but they didn't actually bring any charges, probably because they worried about getting an actual conviction, especially in the state of California. But a number of people did go to jail, and there was a big pushback at the grassroots against that. And when Obama was running on the campaign trail, he said that doctors should be able to prescribe marijuana if it's warranted. He said that when he got in, he was going to change policy so that the Justice Department wasn't wasting resources prosecuting people for doing what was legal under state law. And he fulfilled that promise in his first year. The Justice Department issued guidance to U.S. attorneys. That guidance said, don't waste resources arresting people for medical marijuana if what they're doing is legal under state law. And that guidance held for a couple of years, and a number of states moved forward under that guidance. But in the last year, the Obama administration has completely reversed course. They're engaging in a very significant number of raids throughout California. U.S. attorneys are sending letters to landlords threatening to prosecute them and take away their businesses, their property under asset forfeiture laws if they dare to rent space to medical marijuana dispensaries that are legal under state law. U.S. attorneys are even sending letters to state policymakers, conveniently timed to influence state decision-making processes when policymakers are considering either passing a medical marijuana law or expanding an existing law or regulating legal marijuana. The Treasury Department is threatening to go after banks that open up checking or savings accounts for medical marijuana dispensaries. The IRS is denying medical marijuana dispensaries normal, everyday business tax expenses and are digging up obscure laws to slap on some other tax fines. The ATF is now saying that any medical marijuana patient that is caught possessing a firearm is going to get 10 years in federal prison, which is effectively denying tens of thousands of Americans in 16 states their Second Amendment right. And then, perhaps, I guess most chillingly, U.S. attorneys have been hinting that they're going to arrest state employees who are implementing medical marijuana laws or who are implementing regulations or who involve somehow in the licensing and taxing of marijuana. And they're making these vague threats despite the fact that there's no provision within the Controlled Substances Act that makes it a crime for state employees to enforce regulations that help a state define conduct that is legal under state law. So the Justice Department's threats are largely hollow. Since 1996, hundreds of state and municipal employees have been involved in the licensing and regulation of medical marijuana producers and providers in Colorado, California, Maine, New Mexico. The federal government hasn't threatened any of those state officials. It hasn't prosecuted any of those state officials. And in fact, I know of no instance in modern history in which the federal government has prosecuted a state official for enforcing state law. Not even at like the height of the civil rights battles over segregation did the federal government go in and arrest state officials for enforcing state law. So it kind of defies logic and precedent that the federal government is actually going to do this. Still, they've managed to scare some state officials. The governor of Washington vetoed legislation that would have applied a greater level of regulation to the medical marijuana industry in Washington. But, they didn't overturn medical marijuana. It's still there. It's just less regulated. And so the net result was creating more chaos. The governor of Delaware recently said he's not going to move forward with implementing regulations because he's afraid. But for the most part, most states have realized that there is no real harm to state employees. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, drawing on his own experience as a former U.S. attorney, realized the federal government's not actually going to go in and arrest state officials. He said, we're moving forward. Arizona's moving forward. Rhode Island's moving forward. Vermont's moving forward. D.C., the nation's capital, recently legalized marijuana for medical use. It's moving forward with its regulations. When you add all these threats up, I think you can reach two conclusions. One, it's clear that the Obama administration, their policy on medical marijuana is far worse than the Bush administration's policy. It's far more aggressive and far less compassionate. But despite this escalation, the federal government's barely made a dent in a number of medical marijuana dispensaries that exist in the 16 states. It's had no impact on the growing number of Americans who are legally allowed to use marijuana with a doctor's recommendation. So the federal government can't stop states from legalizing the growing, the use or distribution of marijuana. They can't force states to make anything a crime. They can't make states arrest anyone. The federal government can go in and arrest people, but they don't really have a lot of resources, and 99% of all marijuana arrests are at the local and the state level. And so a state decriminalizing or legalizing marijuana is going to provide an enormous amount of protection. And just to put this in perspective, one tally of the number of Americans either in federal prison for medical marijuana or with cases pending is 68. So 68 Americans either in federal prison for medical marijuana or currently being prosecuted by the feds for medical marijuana. In contrast, there are hundreds, possibly thousands of medical marijuana dispensaries in California, and that's just one of the 16 medical marijuana states. According to the California State Board of Equalization, Despite 16 years of hostile federal interference, marijuana dispensaries in California bring in an estimated $870 million to $2 billion in revenue annually. California NORML estimates there are between 750,000 and 1 million medical marijuana patients in California, roughly 2% of the state's population. It's a lot easier in other states in which you have statewide registration where the patients have to register with the Department of Public Health. So in Montana, there's about 30,000 registered patients, which is about 3% of the population. More than 60,000 people in Michigan are legally allowed to use marijuana for medical use. And it's certainly unfortunate to the 68 people who are either in federal prison for medical marijuana or currently being prosecuted, but that is a drop in the bucket. The federal government can't stop medical marijuana. We don't have to guess what they're going to do if Colorado or Washington votes to legalize marijuana like alcohol. They spent the last decade and a half trying to undermine state medical marijuana laws. And medical marijuana has 70 to 80% voter support. So if the DEA and the Justice Department, if they're willing to arrest cancer and AIDS patients and willing to go into states that are trying to help their most vulnerable citizens, they're certainly going to go ballistic over full-on legalization. But their options are surprisingly limited. They might make some arrests, they might go in and close down a marijuana store here or there, but it's going to be a very, very small fraction of the overall marijuana industry. And so I'm not saying that Colorado and Washington or any state, Texas, for instance, legalizing marijuana is without risk. But the federal government has a really big bark, but a surprisingly small bite on this issue. Their options are very, very limited. And their options are probably even more limited when it comes to stopping other countries. Moreover, and I guess in closing, I just want to talk about the consequences of inaction and summarize, I think, what a lot of people have talked about today. Because I do think it's important to really put drug prohibition generally, but marijuana prohibition in particular, in a very moral context. As other panelists have said today, marijuana prohibition transfers tens of billions of dollars a year into the hands of organized crime, insurgents, and terrorists around the world. It's fueling corruption. It causes violence. In some places, it's an existential crisis to the very existence of the state. I think as was mentioned earlier, last year alone there were 750,000 marijuana arrests in the United States just for simple possession. Tens of millions of Americans have been arrested for marijuana over the last 40 years. All of them are coming out with convictions, and whether they're in for a night or 5 years, doesn't matter. They have that conviction, they have that scarlet letter. Makes them hard to get a job, makes them hard to get housing, makes them hard to get various benefits. And the racial aspect, and Reverend Sanders was right on, and Michelle Alexander was right on. And the only thing I would add to that is that racial dynamic isn't just about the United States or the United Kingdom. Wherever you look at this, whether it's Latin America, whether it's Europe, Eastern Europe, Asia, it plays out in a very, very same way that various racial and ethnic minority populations represent a very disproportionate population of people who are being arrested and prosecuted. And I think it's time that we stop even talking about marijuana laws and marijuana prohibition as crime control or even a criminal justice issue, because it really is a mechanism for governments to wage war on racial ethnic minorities. And that's the case here in the U.S., it's the case wherever. I guess finally, for countries, for states that are considering moving forward, there's very little, I think, that the federal government's going to be able to do. They certainly can be a nuisance. There may be limits to how far states can go and some of the aspects of various regulations, but for the most part, they can remove criminal penalties. And that they're going to have to. Like, I live and work in D.C. I lobby Congress. I can tell you right now, Congress is the last place reform is going to happen. States are going to have to lead on this. And that's how alcohol prohibition ended. states said, you know what, we're not doing this anymore. You want to come in and arrest our people, you go ahead. We're not going to help you. We're not going to assist you. And it turned out the federal government didn't have the resources. And as more and more states exited the prohibition system, the federal government was forced to follow. And for the other countries, it's being discussed in Latin America and Costa Rica and Mexico, in Colombia, Guatemala, and there's certainly risks to moving forward. There's risks to upsetting the United States, but I do think that the U.S. can't credibly go to another country and say, we oppose legalization, and you shouldn't legalize marijuana, when the U.S. government can't even control its own states. 14 states just, have decriminalized marijuana. 16 states have legalized marijuana for certain populations. Because of our system of dual sovereignty, saying the United States supports marijuana prohibition would be like saying the European Union supports a war on marijuana. I'm sure, I don't know what the stance if the European Union has an official position against decriminalization, but certainly many member states of the European Union have set their own policy, and many members of the United States have set their own policy. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill, very much. Okay, let's take about a 10-minute break, and we'll come back in and wind up for the day.